Keith Furness rang me up to see if I would assist with practical examinations for electrotherapy just before I started in the school, and I'd had little experience in electrotherapy, let alone teaching or examining students. However, I got my Claytons out and I read it and managed to survive being one of the staff examining students for electrotherapy just before I took on a full appointment at the school. I was interested in teaching, but I was never prepared to become a full-time staff member if I didn't have a more formal qualification, and obviously there hadn't been the opportunity for people to have formal qualifications other than getting their teachers' diplomas, but I just felt that we were the beginning of a new era and that I needed some more grounding in education before I went on to the school. I guess I paved a path in a way in terms of taking on this new challenge that the university was offering and undertaking a master's even though I didn't have the underlying degree. And of course now it's very different and all sorts of people do all sorts of things with prior knowledge and experience and getting into master's programs through different routes. But it was a big thing for the university to open up its doors to other people, even though we had been sort of students as undergrads, but you didn't have the university degree. It was a certificate, in fact, that we got from the hospital, which then became converted by the Polytechnic a little later. So I then joined the school staff at the old School of Physiotherapy on Hanover Street, which is the one that I'd trained in. But of course, by then, it had just been taken over by the Polytechnic in 1975, certainly after I had finished. But I remember the debates when I was a student and a new grad about whether the Polytechnic should take over the school. The staff were very resistant. Nobody was really keen. At one stage there was talk of going to the Polytechnic that was in Petone between Lower Hutt and Wellington, and none of us ever wanted to do that. We could just see that that was writing on the wall. So fortunately that didn't happen. But from an education perspective in those days, the staff were wanting better conditions and a better environment for the students, and the ministry, or the still a Department of Health, was wanting to get out of education, which really wasn't its primary brief. So for all sorts of reasons it was important to go into the university, but the trial of getting into the university was horrendous. There were blocks in all sorts of places at all sorts of levels, and people like Billy McLeod will have told you about that. There were blocks, there were petitions and there were submissions, and you thought you were getting there, but the audit report of 76, I think, was just turned down by the powers that be in the hospital board, and so there we were, stuck again. It wasn't that the education of the students was at all diminished by being in the Polytechnic. That wasn't our issue. It was the fact that it was a closed-ended program and that physiotherapy couldn't grow. People like me and also Judy Wilson and others who were doing education outside of the context of the school had to literally go and do it alone because there was no route for physiotherapy, and so several of us were really keen to try to get that route for physiotherapy, to grab back what we had initially in 1913 when the school had been established. So I came to the school in 88, and it was the old Hanover Street School, but there were talks at that stage of having to go down to the Polytechnic campus, which was a new campus behind the university, and we were very resistant. We were still very much our own little body, and I know we had to go sometimes up to Tennyson Street, which is where the administration of the Polytechnic still was in those days, and we would have to join in with other staff at meetings, but we always felt different, we always seemed different, and I think we were quite a threat to the other people within the Polytech, simply because we just felt a bit like fish out of water. But ultimately the new premises were built, and we did move down to behind the university, and again it was a modern building, and one of the best features of it was the swimming pool, although they forgot to put the steps in the design, so we had to make a modification there. So I moved with the school down to the new premises, and we were talking at that stage of degree programs and where the school was going to head for the future. I was quite involved with the society again by then. Actually, shortly after I'd come back from Hong Kong, I was approached to go on the committee, and there was, as is often the case, nobody ever wanted to be the chair, and things were slightly down-spirited, I think, and so I ended up becoming the chair of the Otago branch soon after I came back from Hong Kong, and trying to give it a bit of a revamp and encourage people to participate and contacting and communicating people. I used to write or ring and ask them, if they could come or what ideas they had, and so we were trying to really revamp the branch. Just as an aside in terms of the society, I know again in the 80s there was a year where there was no conference, that we used to have these regular conferences, and they were organised by branches. They weren't actually organised by the Central Society, and Auckland couldn't get it off the ground. They didn't have any sort of cohesion, and they were not successful with getting the conference off the ground. So I suggested that we should have it. And so people like Grace Wilson were very enthusiastic, and we had a good little committee, and we had our conference in Dunedin very successfully in '84. And that was the time when Mike Lamont was president, and as I mentioned before, we had this invitation from the university to think about undertaking their new program. So that was a successful conference. It brought a vibrancy back into the society again. So it was soon after that that I became a member of the Education Committee of the society, and we were talking seriously about where the future of the profession lay and what we needed to do. And we were beginning to have very serious discussions about submissions to the university and creating a degree program. So many of the old powers from the society were involved in that education committee, and then there was also the Dunedin group like Judy and myself who were involved from this end. I remember we had secret discussions at Karitani about what we were going to do with making a submission to the university, and because we were invited to make a presentation to them about the degree program and coming into the university, and it was all quite top secret, but there were the beginnings of interest from some of the university people about having physiotherapy, but they were always still wary about whether we would cope or not. And so the example of myself, I suppose, in terms of managing to do a master's was used as an example of the fact that physiotherapists could manage and that we could be successful in the university. So those discussions went on through the 80s, and finally the agreement was made that there be a conjoint program for a degree at the university, which was linked with the Polytechnic. We were still going to teach the physiotherapy, but the university would take on the other programs. Already they had anatomy and physiology. That had never gone from the university, and that was the agreement in 1915 when the school went into the hospital system. So that was not a problem, but then there was the pathology and other lectures that were going to be taken over by the university. And we also had a very good program linked with the School of Physical Education, where students did motor learning or biomechanics as one of the papers through the School of Physical Education. So we launched our degree program in 1990, and that was the time that Billy McLeod retired, just when the program was about to come in, and we had the new person from Australia. She was just about through her PhD and certainly hadn't finished it when she was appointed. Robin Grota came as the new head of the School of Physiotherapy in the Polytechnic, and we were all still thinking at that time that there would be hope for us to get into the university, and I know Robin was keen for that to happen. And one of the things that was a very important component of this agreement to run the conjoint degree was that the degree was solely awarded by the university, and that was really important in terms of ownership of the degree and whose degree it was. And it would have been very difficult to have a conjoint degree awarded by two institutes anyway, but it was the first step in the door was actually to get the conjoint degree awarded by the university. So Robin came, and we were also starting at that stage we had a fast track group for the first year to get a cohort of students through, and they were people mainly who had degrees from physical education or science or something like that. So that was our transition program. We also had a bridging program option available that was taken up by a few people. One of them, Melinda Gardner, came and undertook the degree program, and she and I worked on developing a study to look at falls in people in a rest home in Mosgiel that the school had a link with for sending our students for education. And so I arranged with her for her to be a participant and to do her little research program in that area. And Belinda went on to do some very successful research and to get her PhD in falls, and that was the beginning of the Dunedin Falls study and things like that. So although I don't have any claim at all to being involved with the study itself, at least I initiated her beginnings in terms of her PhD with that group of falls patients.